What would you do if the child in your arms wasn't yours? Amanda Okoro asked herself that question in the dark, more often than she admitted. In the silence of her mansion, when the staff had gone and the rooms conceded to the slow, neutral hum of the refrigeration units and the distant city lights, she would press her palm flat against the small roundness of her belly and speak into the quiet as if conversation could shape fate. "Come on out," she whispered one night, the house listening. "Come and see how much I have kept for you." She was 65, but the years had not softened the precision of her features. Money had layered her life in appointments, polished facades, trophies of acquisition. It had not, however, solved the way emptiness could settle like dust in the corners. She had built fortunes and reputations. She had lost a husband to time and a daughter to the friction of a life that required choices she could not unmake. This late pregnancy was an answer and a surprise, something she guarded with the ferocious tenderness of the newly bereft. The pregnancy had arrived as a promise she could still call her own. Outside the glass wall of her master bedroom, the city of Lagos blinked and shifted, a mosaic of commerce and private grief. Inside, the house was a museum of her success and an archive of her solitude. A rocking chair sat unused by the nursery. Tiny shoes lined up in a lacquered case that never quite matched the practical, rumpled energy a child would bring. Amanda had learned over long, lonely seasons to make her solitude ceremonial. Fresh flowers in the evenings, recorded lullabies that played when the building's skin grew too loud. She watched the recordings sometimes and allowed herself to imagine the rhythm of a small heartbeat beneath her hand. Her twin sister, Amarka, watched a different life. Where Amanda had inherited, amplified, and fortified, Amarka had been left to carve meaning from scarcity. The sisters had not simply chosen different paths. History had nudged them into rigid roles. Amarka's features had once matched Amanda's so closely that only the tilt of a smile would betray the separate souls beneath. Amanda's tight, unmarked control, and Amarka's habitual dissatisfaction. Jealousy was an old vine in their relationship, trained and pruned by years of unequal luck. When Amanda bought an island house for a summer retreat, Amarka watched the photographs in her cramped sitting room and imagined. When Amanda's board members toasted her success, Amarka's mouth tasted acrid with things not said aloud. Resentment was never a single thunderclap. It was a slow weathering. Amarka learned to hide it beneath small courtesies. She kept her voice low, her plans folded into the palms of her hands. She had sons, Chisholm, who sharpened cruelty into a private talent, and Emma, who drifted like a second-hand umbrella in his shadow. They were her claim to a family life she never quite saw on the horizon for herself.
She spent nights making ledger sheets of debts and dreams, what it would take to buy a life, if she could. When Amanda invited Amarka's boys back into the mansion, it was a quiet, impulsive kindness she would later describe as simple longing for laughter. "They can come for a while," she told her house manager. "I need company. We will have dinner. The children can play in the garden." It sounded like a small, harmless plan, a way to fill the house with the noise she had been missing. Amarka accepted with a smile that read loyalty and calculation both. She accepted a return ticket to a place she had always wanted to possess, if only by proximity. There were other men in the story, men who threaded into the lives of both Amanda and the family she would later wrong. Jacob was a mechanic, whose hands knew the language of metal and heat. He smelled of engine oil and the clean sweat of labor. In a life that threaded together chance and circumstance, he had found his way briefly, desperately, into Amanda's orbit. Their relationship had never been simple. A sheltered alliance, a stolen comfort at a moment when Amanda was both generous and reckless. Later, a wound he could not stitch completely. Jacob had a life at the edge of the city. Small shop, small bills, a wife named Miriam, and a daughter called Helen, who loved muddy knees and the stubborn quiet of toolboxes. Miriam and Jacob carried the weight of marriage in the way that practical people do, with grocery lists, with debt notices folded into the morning news. They learned to forgive and forget in small increments. Jacob was not noble in a mythic way. He was practical, prone to mistakes, capable of love and error in equal measure. When a rumor started in their neighborhood, whispers of a woman with a fortune who had looked his way, Miriam tightened around the family, suspicious and fierce. Jacob felt the sting of shame more than the heat of defense. Dr. Adme's hands were another kind of tool. He was a hospital physician with expensive vices and a ledger of personal debts. He had been in the public hospital for years, moving through routines and the carved hollows of bureaucracy. Money could be a leash for men like him. He rationalized his weaknesses by telling himself that the families he enrolled in his private dealings were not innocent, that the rules were flexible, that survival came first. When night came for the birth, the house held its breath. Amanda's labor was long and tender, a flood of things she had not expected, the flinching memory of her mother, the foreign joy of a life coming back into the world because of her. The nursery lights had been left to a soft amber. Olivia, her favorite midwife, took notes with practiced calm. The hospital echoe smelled of antiseptic and sleep. Amanda's hands were small in the staff's palms, and the monitors made a steady, ordinary music.
She birthed in the smallest, filigreed hours of an ordinary Tuesday, and when the first solid cry came, she wept the way people weep when something they have held only in the imagination steps finally into reality. She did not know then how fast grief could be manufactured. Amarka watched the birthing ward like a hawk in human skin. She had not wanted to come into the hospital. She had insisted on staying in the waiting room, pretending to read, but her fingers had been restless with a plan. She had arrived with a familiar face at her side, Chisholm's long bent grin and Emma's vacant sympathy, but the woman who moved through the ward under cover of a cheap scarf was not the sister who came to comfort. Her calm was something else, a folded, rational anger that had been given a target. She moved with the practiced efficiency of a person who had counted out sums in the dark and decided that a risk would yield enough return to be worth it. Dr. Adme accepted the envelope like a man who had been waiting for permission. He accepted small revenges of debt and the slippery protection of cash because it was easier than the moral arithmetic of refusing. The money went into a pocket that had been fitted for exactly this kind of hunger. He told himself that he could control the outcome, that he was not stealing life but rearranging the burdens of it. When the staff shifted, when the nurse distracted herself with paperwork, Adme's practice became a transaction. The nursery sat behind a glass wall that showed rows of small blankets and urgent, helpless sounds. Nurses filed and checked tags. The routine was rote, comfortable, but the world is often undone by 2 minutes. 2 minutes can change everything for a life. No movement in the delivery corridor matched the weight of what was about to happen. Amarka walked lightly, as one who had practiced her steps in mirrors and in the small, lonely rooms where she slept. She had learned where the cameras did not look long, where a hand could slide through the open nursery door and find the tag she wanted to change. There was a plan for everything. There had been months of small, almost polite deceptions, calls returned with the wrong urgency, a sob quietly withheld for effect, the slow engineering of a situation so that the swap would look, at a glance, like fate. Amanda was in recovery, a towel of warmth around her shoulders. The baby in the bassinet near her bed, Peter, as the midwives had announced, lay quiet and pale, eyes closed in the dreamy way infants have. Amanda's hand brushed a small cheek and she exhaled a prayer of thanks. She did not see the shadow that leaned over the glass, nor the hand that adjusted the name on the tag for a half-second like a seamstress making a last invisible stitch. In the nursery, surgeon's lamplight cast harsh honesty over tiny forms. A nurse, new, distracted, turned her back for a second, her attention captured by a misplaced chart. In that second, the world slipped its skin. Dr. Adme crossed the threshold with the furtive grace of a man who had rehearsed a lie. He reached for a pair of tags and, with a practiced motion, replaced the ones on the wrong bassinets. 2 infants were swapped like files on a desk. He sent one infant out to the ward with Amanda, and the other, the healthy boy with quick blue eyes, into the cool anonymity of an orphanage under a different name. Gold and paper changed hands in a quiet corridor. Amarca's smile that night was not triumphant so much as relieved. When the car bore her away from the hospital, she carried the weight of a deed completed and the beginning of a fortune imagined. Chisholm watched the baby in the back seat as if violence were a spectator sport and the child's small round mouth was a prop. Emma watched too, his expression a blankness that made Amarca steadier. They drove away into the folds of the night and the city's indifferent glow. Amanda left the hospital radiant, exhausted, and certain. She brought home a child wrapped in the hospital's soft white blanket. The mansion received them like an altar. For 2 days the rooms sang with newness. Amanda would pace the hallways with the baby's weight balanced against her chest, and the house seemed at last to fit. But life is not only the room at a moment. There had been and would be small oddities that morning that did not fit into the narrative that Amanda wanted. The baby in her arms did not follow the nurse's light with curious lashes. It did not flinch when the sun found the window. It closed its eyes often, and when it cried, it would sometimes do so in a single thin note, like a closed instrument. Amanda's heart tightened. Doctors were called. There was talk of ophthalmologists and congenital conditions, of premature development. The medical words were clinical. They felt like waiting rooms. Amanda was not a woman to surrender to ignorance. She demanded tests and explanations, clung to the hope that the bright cloud would pass. She stood in hallways at night with the baby swaddled and whispered to it things she would have otherwise saved for a lifetime. Names of flowers, the cities she had loved, the way sunlight tasted when it settled on a river. She called the child Peter because the nurse had read the name from a card in the hospital rush. The name felt somehow both wrong and perfectly right. Back in the poor neighborhood where Jacob mended cars and Miriam carried the work of a family, life continued with the precise cruelty of small bills. Jacob had been at the shop the week Amanda went into labor. He had not been in the hospital. He had not known that his life was about to be folded into a secret. But the world had its ways of keeping tabs on small injustices. Rumors ran their fingers like cold across faces, whispers of a baby, a woman in a wealthy house, a nurse who had been seen counting notes in the parking lot. People who live with less watch details and remember them like prayers.
At the orphanage, the real baby arrived like a package, thin, quiet-eyed, cradled by a woman named Sister Agnes, who saw in him the blunt, raw potential of a child at the margins. They named him Philip on the registration form because the orphanage insisted on an official identity and because a name can be a shield. He ate small meals and learned quickly which cries got attention. In his first weeks, he drew shapes in the air with his fingers, as if practicing the world. He watched the world intensely, not with sight alone, but with the kind of attention people confine to those who must learn to survive without easy resources. He was brilliant in the way hunger sometimes makes minds sharpen. Sister Agnes, with the kind of compassion that does not soft-pedal reality, folded him into routines that could keep him alive. Amarca took her cut of the transaction the way a person collects rent. She showed her sons the child she had brought into Amanda's house, as if laying a claim. The child grew under her roof in a life of red carpets and quiet neglect. Money could buy silk and cures and the best doctors. It could not buy empathy, cannot press into the places where a child's soul asks for permission to be known. Chisholm, selfish and resentful, learned the cruel arts of a small household, mocking the child when he cried, taking pleasure in the power a stronger boy has over a weaker one. Amanda's generosity unfolded with a helpless grace that left her vulnerable to manipulation. She gifted the world to the child she believed was hers, and in doing so she built walls that others used for shelter. The house became a study in contradiction. Amanda invested in therapies and tutors, dialing specialists from far-off networks. She read books until her eyes tired. She invented projects to fill the time. She told the child stories of ancestry and land. In the softest hours, she would stroke the baby's cheek and ask with the ridiculous human hope that people like her habituate for a sign that she was enough. The child, who did not see the faces, who navigated the world by scent and sound, learned the cadence of her voice and answered it in the small ways a child does, by curling into her, by gripping her hand like a lifeline. If betrayal had a geometry, it was folded into the rooms where these people slept. Amarca stood at the margins, calculating. Dr. Adme fretted over his needle marks of guilt and swallowed his bribe like a bitter pill. Jacob, meanwhile, felt the weight of something he could not name like a stone in his chest. He had not been able to say that the child might have belonged to him. He had not spoken the truth to Miriam, who patched together rumors and suspicion and feared the worst. Their marriage, already frayed, tightened into something that made little room for argument. Helen watched her father and learned to stand taller than her age, the way children do when they wish to patch adult cracks with their own small insistence.
The days after the birth were tender and tendering. Amanda posted photographs of the baby, soft-focused, hand on cheek, onto the quieter corners of her social world. People sent flowers, gifts, and notes. Her business staff sent their cautious, congratulatory emails. A life had been renewed at the center of fortune, and people watched with the mix of envy and admiration that marks such spectacles. They were not, in those public frames, asked to look at the subtle things that mimic trauma. A child who never looked directly at a face, a mother who began to measure love in tests and visits. For a brief, luminous while, there was what everyone longs for: soft afternoons, tiny fingers curled about her thumb, the mammal peace of a house that hummed with nurture. Amanda named each new wrinkle in her life with gratitude. She walked through the garden and taught the little boy how to listen for the train's whistle and the way rain meant different things on different leaves. She taught him the names of the vegetables in her greenhouse. She read to him about ships. She traced the map of the coastline on the back of his hand. At night, when she would come into the nursery, the child would reach for her and call out with a sound that made something in her chest unclench. She would sing old songs, not always perfectly remembered, and the child would tilt his face toward her, relying on the warmth and the vibration of her throat. Amanda promised herself that she would be fierce enough to protect him from the world's worst edges, even while she failed to see the sharper designs being cut into the margins of that protection. Amid the tenderness, small fractures appeared. Staff whispered. A nurse who had been on duty that night took leave, and then another, citing personal reasons. A small maintenance man noticed and thought the exchange at the hospital had been odd. In the alley behind Jacob's shop, men who traded in gossip measured risks and murmured that Dr. Admi had been seen near the orphanage. It was the sort of rumor one expects in city life, small, persistent weeds poking through the cracks of more imposing structures. But no one in the mansion suspected the breadth of the plan that had swept through their lives. Amanda's joy was not fraudulent. It was a self-contained sun around which she oriented everything. Her trust in the people who opened her house to her was not naive but earnest. She would, in later months and years, look back and find threads she could pull and see the pattern of betrayal unfold like a frayed hem. But in those first soft weeks, she tucked the boy into blankets and let life press forward. She did not yet know what it would cost her to love the child she thought was hers. In the meantime, Philibep, the boy who had been packed into an orphanage ledger, grew with the stubborn resilience of cramped lives. Sister Agnes noticed his small, precise attention.
He would sit by a window and listen to children playing and not be jealous. He spun their laughter into patterns in his head and counted them like beads. He learned to read the expressions people made when they were serious, and he mapped his future on small victories. A teacher who praised a scribbled number, a clean shirt on Sunday. The world of the orphanage was tight and consequential. It was not kind in the ways a wealthy house could be. Instead, it taught endurance and the grammar of making do. Across town, Amarka planned how to use a child like someone might use a pawn, to open doors, to manipulate hearts. She planned dinners where Amanda would praise philanthropic work and not notice the sly exchanges beneath the table. She orchestrated small, private reports of the child's development to attract specialists who could say, without being asked, that some children needed more attention, or that certain developmental trajectories required money. She positioned the child as a kind of living testament to her own life's work, a symbol of what she could provide if only the world would notice. And Dr. Admi's nights were restless. He counted money with one hand and the cost in the other, debt collectors at his door, a university loan that would not go soft. He had rationalized the swap as a piece of business, and yet the memory of the nurse's startled face and the precise tiny fingers of the newborn when he had set him down haunted him like a photograph in 3 dimensions. He tried to wash his hands of it in the mornings, and failed. Rumors began to coalesce into small riots of suspicion. A nurse who muttered about shifts, a maintenance worker who registered a security latch that had been tampered with, a driver who had seen Amarka's car idling too close to the hospital. The city kept its own ledger of secrets, but the mansion kept its own rhythms, and Amanda, in the center, tended them like a gardener who believed in a single perfect season. On a rain-heavy afternoon, weeks after the birth, Amanda sat in the nursery with the child asleep on her chest. The house had the soft smell of lemon oil and baby powder. She traced a fold in the blanket and thought of the sound of the train. She felt in that small domestic kingdom the exactness of things moving into place. She did not yet suspect the cost of the coin that had purchased her peace. Somewhere, in a cheap flat up a narrow street, Jacob tightened a new bolt on a fan belt and thought of a child he had never held. He remembered a woman at a party laughing, her eyes meeting his across a table. He had said nothing of the possibility, and there was shame in that silence. He took his daughter Helen to the market and watched her bargain with a fierce smile, the kind of heart that would, in time, need to be taught how to forgive habits like silence. That winter, rain turned the concrete into a mirror, and the city glowed.
Amanda's halls hummed, and the nursery lights were left at the kind of dim that bespoke guardianship. Amarka sat in a cafe counting the letters of her plan, smoothing out small infinities until the edge of the next move was visible. Dr. Admi drank black coffee and laid his palms flat on the table to feel that he was still the owner of his fate, then felt the tremor that comes before a man understands that his choices have been larger than he expected. If the world pauses at a hinge, this was the hinge turning. The swap had been executed in 2 minutes and sealed in a pocket of cash. In the quiet that followed, pieces were set, and the chessboard emerged with its new pieces. A child in wealth who did not see, a child in poverty who would learn to see with bone and mind, a family that would love and love imperfectly, a sister who had cut a seam with the sharpness of jealousy, a doctor whose hands could not be trusted with the sanctity he was supposed to guard. Amanda did what she always did when the weight of a new responsibility pressed upon her. She tried to be both parent and president, caretaker and commander. She built schedules for therapy, made appointments with the best specialists, and insisted that the child be taught music for sensory development and that tutors be brought in for language acquisition. She told people that if resources could help, she would spare no cost. She believed with a steady, determined faith that everything would be mended under the discipline of care. But life keeps its own promises too. Some months later, a maintenance worker at the hospital, cleaning out a storage closet behind the nursery, found something small and wrong, an identification tag not matching the roster. He folded it into his pocket as if to keep the city's secret secure, and took it home because there was a small hope of the reward. He did not realize that his discovery would take time to unravel. Time, as ever, is slow to offer justice. It is immediate in its cruelty. The baby in Amanda's arms grew heavy and beaming and quiet. She arranged playdates, invited child development specialists, and introduced him to the friends she had left in the rooms where she built business. She taught him the word for river and the scent of the ocean. She took pride in his way of listening, his small laugh. She showed him photographs of the family tree with the meticulousness of someone mapping a territory that she wanted to be vast and unbroken. At night she would hold him and whisper, "I will guard you." She meant it. She did not know how carefully a promise can be arranged by other hands. The city kept its small hum of commerce and rumor. The orphanage fed Philip soup and taught him to string numbers into a protection. It taught him to notice the people who noticed him. Sister Agnes folded him into the routine, and the routine folded him into something other than erasure. She told him stories of patience and stubbornness, and taught him to thread meaning from the small gifts she could spare. None of them, in those early months, knew what the future would demand of them. They only had the small lights of the present, a lullaby, a handshake, the rustle of someone counting money in an alley. The swap had been a thin, dangerous thing, a brief transaction carried out in the light of convenience. Its consequences would not be immediate in the way of a snapped bone. Rather, they would unfurl across years, unspooling in the quiet undoing of trust and in the dull ache of identity. Amanda mounted a small pedestal of hope and wrapped herself in it like armor. She was, in every way, the kind of woman who could buy affections, but not buy certainty. She had not known then that a camera in the hospital had been pointed just off the nursery door. She had not known the angle that would later show, in a moment the world could rewind and examine, a sister's hand slipping into the line where fate was being measured. She had not known that 2 minutes could contain the ruin of many lives. On a day when the rain was thin and the city seemed to draw breath, Amanda sat in the nursery and listened to the small, irregular breathing of the child she loved. She would, in time, be taught that love complicates the search for truth. For now, she was a mother in the purest sense, fearful, brave, and naive. She smoothed his blanket and hummed a tune her own mother had once sung, and the baby tightened his grip on the seam of her dress. At the orphanage, Philip chewed the edge of a pencil and shaded small houses into the margin of a composition book. He was learning to keep himself company.
He was learning to look for patterns. He would not, in those early weeks, know that someone somewhere had traded places with his future. Across town, Amarka placed the last naira of the bribe into a drawer and considered for the first time in months what it would mean to have access. She allowed herself a small private smile. And Dr. Admi, in his small clinic the next street over, washed his hands and watched the water run down like a measure of time he could not reclaim. He did not yet understand that the small pocket of cash he had taken would spiral into legal files and shattering, or that it would years later press its way into a test tube and a laboratory seat with a technician who would open an envelope and speak a name with the fatal clarity of science. For now, there was only night and the hum of refrigerators and the sound of a small boy breathing in a place where he was cherished. For now, there were small lies that had not yet toppled into catastrophe, only the quiet, reliable belief that people can make their homes out of anything they hold dear. What would you do, the city seemed to ask, if one day the evidence showed your best intention to be a kind of theft?
If the people involved had known how loud that question would one day be, they might have chosen different paths. But the choices had been made. The future would not wait. The present held its fragile brightness, and in its light, the pieces were beginning to fall into alignment for reasons no one in that warm night yet understood. If you are still with me, if this question rattles you in the way it rattled Amanda, leave a thought below. Tell me what you would do if the child in your arms was suddenly not your child. There is a moment after every small theft when the world looks ordinary again. Amanda went home and set the baby into a room that smelled of lemon and new paint. The house received them like a cathedral takes in the faithful. She arranged a photograph on the nursery wall and smiled with the exhausted, private gratitude of a woman who had just been given a second chance. But some things do not forget. A week later, a small something, an administrative mistake at the orphanage, would give a clerk reason to look twice at a file. A clerk's glance has the power of slow things, wheels of investigation that start in small offices and roll on, picking up dust and evidence. There would be an unattended camera angle in the hospital, a maintenance worker who could not rest, a mother in a distant neighborhood who would not be silent forever. In the nursery that night, Amanda rocked Peter, feeling the shape of him, memorizing the soft slope of his cheek. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. The child who had never known more than her voice tightened his hold and sighed. She promised him again, in that small, absolute way mothers promise, protection, an endless supply of care, a life of dignity. Outside, the city breathed on. Inside, a sister counted her gain like currency. A doctor wiped his hands and tried to forget. A boy at an orphanage traced a house in pencil and dreamed of a name that would, in time, be spoken aloud in a room with fluorescent lights and a woman in a white coat. Time, as it does, kept the small things moving toward consequences. In pockets and files and the soft click of CCTV playback, the truth would find teeth. But on that night, the house hummed, and a mother fell asleep with a child in her arms. The lullaby thinned into sleep and left the house to its quiet. The world had been rearranged with astonishing ease. It would not be undone with the same speed. 5 years later. Time as a practical instrument did what time does best. It softened edges, hardened habits, and arranged small private truths into lives that looked from a distance simply inevitable. The mansion had learned to contain the noise of infancy. It had learned instead to hold a child who did not look at faces but listened for them. The nursery became a room of rituals, low lights, carefully timed music therapy, a tactile map of shapes pinned beside the crib.
Tutors came and went like small storms, leaving test results and cautious notes. Specialists praised Amanda's diligence while remarking, in gentle suspicions, on the boy's lack of visual response. Congenital blindness, they said. We will work with what he has. Amanda listened to medical language the way she listened to quarterly reports, open to interpretation but determined to act. Peter grew into the house's appointed quiet. He knew the scent of each room the way others knew the tangle of a city street, the citrus of the kitchen after Sunday cooking, the lacquered wood of the study where Amanda kept ledgers.
He learned the warm dip of Amanda's voice in the evening and the way the piano's last chords signaled bedtime. He learned by touch and memory. The grain of the dining table, the pattern of the carpet under his feet. He was not happy in the straightforward way children are. He held a contentedness that had the texture of a borrowed comfort. At night, he slept with one hand tucked into a fold in his pillow, fingers curled the way small children curl them when they are trying to hold on to a feeling. Philip grew elsewhere. The orphanage's courtyard was smaller than the mansion's garden, but Philip learned to find space within it. He read the world the way a person reads the inside of a machine. Every noise had purpose, every movement a cause to analyze. Sister Agnes watched him with the protective obsession of someone who's learned to archive small miracles. He could count a passing bus, a bird on a wire, a number of leaves on a certain tree, and he filled registers with the kind of quiet cleverness that made teachers lean forward in the middle of services and say, "This child will go far." He folded paper into planes and launched them from the orphanage's parapet, watching them list and dip like testable hypotheses. In his notebooks, he traced maps of places he'd never seen and penciled the names of the plants Sister Agnes taught him. Hunger had sharpened him, books had steadied him. In the mansion, Chisholm grew from a mean boy into a meaner adolescent. He learned that derision was a form of power, and he wielded it against the things that made him feel small. Peter's blindness became a target. The boy's dependence was a script Chisholm read and then flung back like a weapon. When he was bored, he hid toys in places Peter could not find. When he wanted applause or attention, he provoked scuffles and then painted himself the wounded party. Emma, drifting in the wake of his brother's violence, watched more often than he intervened. Amarka, whose smile had been a ledger of long plans, taught her sons both to admire the currency of cruelty and to be patient in its application. Jacob's hands continued to know engines. He ran a little shop that had, despite everything, kept stable. Miriam kept the house stocked. Helen kept the small, stubborn dignity of a child who had learned to hold her family upright.
Jacob's guilt was a private weather system, sometimes a drizzle, sometimes a low thunder that he refused to speak about. He lived near the orphanage, the way many people who cannot forget a face by night live near the place that could answer a question they cannot yet ask. He watched the world with a careful eye and shrugged off the edges of gossip. When neighbors spoke in low voices about a woman in a mansion and a child who did not see, Jacob shifted his weight, more protective than proud. He had been a man who could remap his life around a truth, if only he ever heard it. Yet he had also been a man who counted costs and kept his mouth shut when silence seemed safer. Amanda's empire, the jagged tower of companies and investments, lost some of the small certainties it had once enjoyed. Decisions that once required a single signature now traded in committees and second opinions. The markets are indifferent to grief. They are easier that way. Losses crept like mildew along relationships, staff that left under vague pretexts, board members who accepted invitations not because of loyalty, but because friendship can be postponed. Amanda's loneliness did not soften. It grew more complex, a layered loneliness that included the fear that even the child she loved could be, unknowingly, the subject of theft. For years she handled both roles, chief executive and dedicated mother, with the energy that had built most of her life. She learned sensory games to teach Peter spatial awareness. She set up lessons that turned noise into music and language. She paid for travel and consultations, never asking whether all that money could stitch a wound it had not caused. She loved in the way she had power to love, with resources, with presence when she could, with a stubborn insistence on care. Still, there were cracks. The tabloids, merciless, curious, started to whisper. 2 midwives who had worked at the Ikoyi hospital moved on and took their hush with them. An ex-employee of the mansion muttered about October nights when spacing seemed off. Rumor has the slow burn of tinder. Small people who make a living selling memories traded in half-truths until a narrative gathered that the world found irresistible. A rich woman, a blind child, a scandal waiting to bloom. In the orphanage, Philip found patterns where other children found pain. He excelled in school and in chores. He learned that running away had no appeal because there was nowhere he truly wanted to go. He invented small systems. He could arrange cups by the pitch of their clink. He could name which pot would boil first by feeling the warmth through the handle. Sister Agnes took pains to nurture his intelligence, bringing used textbooks and mapping opportunities. When an NGO volunteer mentioned a scholarship, Sister Agnes pushed Philip forward with the glee of someone who knows the taste of hope and keeps it close. One evening in the mansion, a guest left a door unlatched.
Chisholm,
emboldened by small cruelties, led Peter to the stairwell and whispered something mean. Peter lost his footing on the polished edge. His world pitched. The fall was not dramatic at first, 15 steps like a long, slow mistake, and then sudden pain. The household erupted. Amanda ran before the staff could lock a door. She found the boy crumpled on the landing, the world bleeding into silence. Her voice cut through like glass. She lifted him as if she could hold the bones together with intention. At the hospital, the emergency slot was bright with clinical motion. Machines scanned, the smell of disinfectant clung to the air, and the medical staff worked with methodical efficiency. They treated broken limbs and internal shock with the hard, exact language of medicine. Peter's diagnosis would include a fracture, perhaps concussion. He needed scans and the comfort only medicine could offer. While the surgeons and physicians mapped the damage, one of the nurses, following protocol, took blood for labs, typing that would reveal a detail even the family couldn't guess. The boy's blood type did not correspond to the file the maternity ward had archived. Blood typing is blunt and incontrovertible. Certain blood types cannot be a child of certain parents. For a mother's team to find no plausible match is a medical red flag, then a human one. "This is an unusual result," the lab tech said quietly to the attending physician. The physician, professional and careful, asked for a repeat sample. The repeat was the same. The words that followed were sterile but charged. "We'll need to review maternity records." Amanda, from a chair in a hall lined with palms and brochures about pediatric care, felt the syllables like cold water. She folded into herself, trying to measure if this was some procedural fluke or a new illness. "He's mine," she said, as if the statement could anchor anything. The phrase was both a plea and a claim. Hospital policy required questions. Records were pulled, and the midwife's notes were checked against the nursery roster. The nurse on duty that night at Okoro, who had later claimed she'd misplaced a chart, was reached and then updated. The person in medical records who handled the tags, a clerk who had grown careless under pressure, was summoned to look at the log. Cameras in the hallways were checked for times and exposures. The 2-minute window, innocuous on paper, became critical. CCTV was summoned. When footage loaded, it was nothing like the drama of films. It was ordinary surveillance, grainy and indifferent. It caught bodies and motion, the pale gown of a nurse, the blur of a hand. It showed for a brief, ridiculous chunk of time the shape of a person leaning into a nursery's view end, then something else. A hand slipping tags, a figure moving between bassinets, a woman's scarf, a car idling in a drop-off lane, details that in ordinary life mean nothing, but here meant everything.
Amanda watched the footage with the kind of attention that reduces sound. She watched the hand that belonged to her sister, a Marcus gait, the administrative lilt to her shoulder, slip through the glass frame. Time seemed to separate and slow. She felt something soft and expansive tear into crisped pieces. The image of herself that had included a child, the image of a sister who loved, and the evidence of a sister who had schemed. She understood in a small and terrible bright moment that what she had thought of as love had been used. Police got involved the way institutions do, by dispatching officers trained in evidence, by taking statements, by making lists of the hospital staff who had been scheduled. They interviewed Dr. Admi, who had been long owed money, who would be on the phone apologizing to creditors before anyone noticed he had a bribe in his back pocket. The man had kept his composure for years with the brittle elasticity of someone used to living on borrowed time. In the cold light of interrogation, his excuses collapsed from the hollow center of someone who had both wanted and needed to be forgiven. The orphanage, when contacted, was a small building that smelled of sun-warmed linens and the faint chemical tang of school glue. Sister Agnes answered questions with the steadfastness of someone who knows the language of loss. She produced a file stamped with the day a boy named Philip had been admitted, thin and hungry, and a name attached to his registration that read like someone's careful erasure. Abandoned, no known parents. The intake papers had little in the way of proof and much in the way of need. But the orphanage did have a ledger and a date and a signature from a woman who had claimed to be a volunteer delivering supplies. Convenient, anonymous, and in hindsight, uncanny. When news of the hospital's findings reached the orphanage, a fold of shock passed through its rooms. Sister Agnes, who had been keeping a careful tally of progress, felt a bubble of protective fury. She would not hand the boy over with certainty. "We will need a DNA match," she told the officers when they arrived, firm, unafraid. "We will protect him until we know." The chain of custody of evidence began to compress. Police officers tracked the orphanage's van route,
and found the registration number that matched the nighttime vehicle seen on the hospital's CCTV. A maintenance worker who had kept an identification tag tucked away in a pocket because he thought the money might buy him a reward was called and asked to produce the tag. He wept when he saw the footage. He had not intended to touch anything as momentous as a child's life. Jacob heard his name in the hours between night and morning like thunder through a distance. A detective came by the shop and asked him to come to the station. No accusation, just questions. Jacob's stomach folded in on itself.
He had been mentioned, in a roundabout way, on a piece of paper at the orphanage, a neighborhood where someone had once said he lived, a man whose life had brushed a wealthy woman's life in a way that never called for explanations. He gave blood for the test because the law asked for it, and because there was a small piece of him that wanted to know. He had assumed any test would be routine, numerical, color-coded. He had not expected the chain of events that followed. The DNA test is a slow, deliberately neutral instrument of truth. Samples were taken, cheek swabs, a vial of blood, labeled with codes and times. For days, the waiting room became a crucible of possibility. Amanda sat in it like a woman who had been living in a story she assumed she authored, and the pages had suddenly begun to show fingerprints of other hands. She held Peter close, as if the boy's warmth could argue against the numbering of genetics. Peter, small and sensitive, closed his eyes and rested his head on Amanda's shoulder. He knew only that his world had always revolved around the sound of her. Philip in the orphanage was brought in under guard, but not in the posture of a criminal. Rather, he was being carried as evidence of a life that had been misdirected. He wore a shirt Sister Agnes had washed herself. He watched the adults talk in their quick, low language and felt a thing he could not name, a tug at the limbic edges of identity. The detectives asked him simple questions, a child's version of inventory, and he replied in short, polite sentences, eyes flicking to see who else might give him a clue. He sensed with that bulb of intuition that hunger sharpens, that his life might be changing, but had no sense of the legal architecture behind such a shift. When the DNA sample analysis came back, the lab's report was a mechanical set of figures and likelihoods. For those who read it like a ledger, it was the end. For those who read it like a human being, it was a beginning with teeth. The numbers showed a match. The boy in the orphanage, Philip, shared genetic markers with Amanda Okoro. The report was definitive when run against both Amanda's and Jacob's samples. It was what the country's plain speech would call incontrovertible. The boy in the orphanage was Amanda's son. He was Jacob's son as well. Philip's name, written on the paper in the sterile font of a lab printout, carried a weight that made Amanda's fingers cold. The moment the officer walked into the room and placed the envelope on the table, the air went thin. People talk about silence like it's a peaceful thing. This one was not. It was full of waiting, a kind of dense pressure. Amanda opened the envelope with hands that trembled. The lab sheet was plain, methodical. When she read the words that confirmed what the chart held, she felt the room slide out from under her like floor removed by a bad landlord.
Philip sat on a plastic chair and watched the woman in the room who had just read his existence on paper. He felt something like recognition. He couldn't know the word mother in all its legal and emotional complexity yet. He had an image, an idea of a woman who held him when he was tiny, in a room that had no windows. An image Sister Agnes had given him by telling him about things, stories that made him sleep. He looked up at Amanda with the fierce clearness children sometimes show when they meet the possibility that their life might make sense. Amanda's first instinct was not triumph. It was a raw, complicated grief, relief wrapped in the ragged cloth of betrayal. She felt as if someone had stolen a piece of her life and then shown it to her in the light. Angry tears made tracks across her cheeks. She stood and walked to Philip like someone crossing a wide plain. He did not flinch. He watched the woman who had been a rumor in his nights and a name in the papers, and reached out, a child's unscripted impulse toward the possibility of home. When their hands touched, it was a small, earthbound contact that reconfigured everything. For Philip, the texture of her skin was new and somehow familiar in a way that the mind could not yet parse. For Amanda, the touch was an answer struck like a bell. She had loved, fiercely and mistakenly, the child named Peter. She had lost and now found, or perhaps found anew, a child she had not known was hers. The DNA had given facts, the touch gave something else, an axis around which future life might pivot. Amanda's mind moved quickly from discovery to consequence. Police moved in with the practical efficiency cultivated in systems that handle crimes of custody. Forms were filled, statements were recorded, and a list of charges formed in legal voices: kidnapping, child trafficking, conspiracy, malpractice. Amarka's name, when it surfaced, came with a look of someone who could not believe they had been found. She was arrested at home, in a house she thought of as an investment in ambition. Chisholm protested, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and bravado. He waved hands as if the law was a rude spectator. Emma, smaller in all things, backed away and put distance between himself and whatever consequences he had shared. Dr. Odmy sat in a small cell that night and watched his life, which had been an array of debts and small reconciliations, collapse into the wide definitions of criminality. He had told himself, for years, that money is a practical thing, that poverty is a ledger with its own urgent appetite, and that the rules were often suggestions. In the cold fluorescent light of detention, his reasoning felt thin. He had been a man who took money from a sister and removed a child from a woman's life. Now the law read his note of survival as theft.
He tried to describe, haltingly, then finally fully, the nights of being hounded by collectors, the offer that looked like an exit, the way hands reached for him at the precise moment his creditors arranged themselves like vultures. The legal system did not require moral nuance in the first moments. It required proof and process, and the proof stacked up. When arrests were made, the household split in ways that were both blunt and painful. Amanda's board convened in hushed meetings about the public relations fallout. Journalists queued and predators feasted on the family's misfortune with the practiced hunger of commerce. The mansion's staff were questioned, their loyalty measured with the kind of administrative suspicion wealth formerly bought its way out of. Amarka, in the cell, tried to understand how the plan she had reasoned like a careful projection had ended in such public ruin. She had rationalized the swap as redress, as the shaping of a future she had been denied. It had become a legal and moral catastrophe she was now blamed for. Jacob watched the arrests from a distance that was exacting and complicated. When he saw Philip, the boy he had not known he fathered, tremble at Amanda's side, something in him reconfigured. He had been a man shaped by small decisions and the belief that silence was a kind of protection. Now silence felt thin and shameful. He reached out to Miriam with an urgency she did not understand at first. He sought to explain, to apologize for the silence, for the possibility that his quiet faith in a small life had cost a child a mother's arms. Miriam, whose fierceness had kept the family upright through lean times, absorbed his words with the fast, small patience of someone who knows love is both enough and not enough. The courtroom moved slowly, as law must. Charges were filed. Defense counsel argued for mitigating circumstances, debt, coercion, desperation, the human calculus of small crimes, and prosecutors pursued the clear intent in Amarka's actions. Dr. Admy's professional license was suspended. Criminal investigators described the medical bribery as a breach both of ethics and of the public's trust. Chisholm was treated as an accomplice in acts of cruelty and complicity. Emma's testimony would be examined for what his silence had permitted. Amanda did not want vengeance. The word trembled inside her like an uninvited shape in a chest. She wanted restitution and a reckoning that would protect both children. She wanted the law to name what had been done and to set up a mechanism to be sure it could not happen again, at least not the way it had happened here. She met Philip with a mix of the corporate succinctness she had cultivated in boardrooms and the raw, messy tenderness she could feel when she thought of motherhood. She told him stories in the first weeks that were small and specific, about the smell of sunny days on an island she owned, about a woman who loved mathematics and music, about a kind of world he could eventually claim. He listened with a head full of things he had collected, and answered with the kind of brave silence children often choose. What Amanda could not do, even after the arrests, was unmake the way Peter had grown into the only fatherless place he'd ever known. For Peter, the world had always begun with Amanda's voice and the stuffed animals that smelled like the house. To remove him from that would be to perform an erasure, both cruel and needless. Amanda felt this clearly. Justice demanded that perpetrators be punished. Mercy demanded that an innocent be protected. She chose to hold both truths. There were lessons to be learned, arrangements to be made. Peter required therapy to process the physical trauma of the fall and the psychological shocks that had always been a part of his life. Neglect disguised as provision, cruelty disguised as family dynamics. He would need consistent caregivers who understood the complexity of attachment. Philip required schooling, first steps to undo years of hunger, and the space to discover who he was when placed between two worlds. She opened her home to Philip, not to erase where he came from, but to offer what she could: education, nurture, and the sort of steady presence the boy had never known. Jacob, too, had to rebuild. His name on the DNA form had been a public thing now. His relationship with Philip moved from rumor to responsibility.
He had to talk to his daughter Helen about what it meant for a man to make mistakes and then to correct them. He had to face a woman, Miriam, who had watched his silence and had learned to make do. It is not a short thing to accept parenthood after absence. It required long conversations, shared vulnerability, and a new kind of scheduling in their small shop. Time to attend hearings, time to be at school plays. There were scenes of confrontation that were not courtroom drama but intimate and brutal in their own right. Amanda confronted Amarka in a visiting room where glass separated them and yet did not entirely insulate. Amarka's voice was small when she spoke. She offered rationalizations that read like arithmetic. "You have what I never had. You were always given more. I took a chance you would not notice." Her words sounded, in the sterility of the room, like a person who had learned to justify a theft as a rebalancing. Amanda's anger was like a precise thing, a scalpel used on a wound to see what lay beneath. She accused and asked, and Amarka sometimes seemed to believe her own reasons, sometimes to shrink away from them. The law would assess intent. The family would measure betrayal.
Chisholm, younger now and with less room to perform cruelty publicly, found himself in court with other evidence stacked against him. Witnesses spoke to his aggression, neighbors to the small acts of intimidation he had trafficked in. The legal system took its measured steps. It sought to account for cruelty, for the ways a household's private life can become a public harm. The public watched with the appetite of a population used to spectacle. Some pieces of coverage were sympathetic. Others were cruel in their simplified narratives. The moneyed woman who had been duped by a sister. The mechanic who became a symbol of the poor man's lost opportunity. Amanda received letters, sympathy and vitriol, sometimes simultaneously. She read them alone in a study that felt both like an office and like a theater. She locked away certain notes, burned others, kept a small selection to remind her that people would always interpret tragedy in ways that fit their own appetites. But private life resumed its ordinary tyranny of needs. The children required practical attention. Philip needed a tutor who could make arithmetic into a game and turn maps into spatial exercises that a boy who had learned by touch could master. He needed an eye exam that would calm anxieties he could not name, and a counselor who taught him how to be anchored to two mothers, the woman who raised him and the woman who belonged by blood. Peter needed the slow, patient work of narrative reorientation, the sense that he was wanted for who he was, not as the byproduct of a theft. Amanda insisted that the household be reorganized to protect him. She removed Chisholm from direct contact with Peter, enforced boundaries with staff, and hired a child psychologist whose job was to be present. In small moments that are not newsworthy, the two boys learned each other. Their first meeting at Amanda's house, after arrests and legal steps, was orchestrated with care and a small arrogance of hope. Philip arrived with Sister Agnes and a social worker. He wore a shirt with its collar slightly askew, the way a child who does not want to be formal wears clothes. Peter sat nearby, his fingers in a clay sculpture Amanda had bought him, wary, and whatever that is between curious and suspicious. They did not bond immediately. Friendship for children with braided histories is not instant. There were tender misfires, Philip attempting to show Peter a trick with a toy car that Peter could not see. Peter offering Philip a small piece of his favorite bread because that was how he measured care. But there were delicate moments that the adults watched like parched people watching a small sprout. Philip, who had learned to count a number of minutes in a sharing game, kept score of the time they spent together. Peter learned, as children do, that another child's voice could be an axis of safety. Amanda watched from the periphery, learning again how to be both a leader and a mother without turning one into the other. She signed forms to adopt legal guardianship arrangements for Philip with care and asked the lawyers to set up protections for Peter's emotional safety. She wanted justice served, but she also wanted to repair, in whatever manner possible, the lives that had been ruptured. Justice, she had learned, can be a blunt instrument that breaks as much as it mends. The law, in its patient way, continued to pursue those who had broken it. Amarka and Dr. Admi faced charges that would follow them for years. The prosecution laid out the chain of evidence, the CCTV footage, the maintenance worker's tag, the bank deposit records for the bribe, and witness statements from hospital staff who had been paid to look another way. The defense painted desperation and the pressures of poverty and debt as mitigating circumstances, but the jury had before it the fact that a child's life had been altered in a transaction. Sentences were handed down in the months that followed, prison terms and fines calibrated to the scale of the crime and the society's need to make a clear statement. The focus on legal punishment, while necessary, never fully encompassed the moral work the family faced in private. Amanda continued to attend to that private work. She took Philip to see the places she loved. She taught him about maps and shipping and music in the same casual breath. She sat with him at night and told him stories that were not about wealth, but about curiosity. She enrolled him in a school with a robust program for children from diverse backgrounds. She gave him a small room in the mansion, down the hall from Peter's, a room with a window and sunlight and a desk where he could do the arithmetic he loved. She was careful to ask Philip what he wanted rather than impose a prescriptive notion of love. He wanted, at first, only the simple things, books and a bowl of mangoes, and someone who would teach him to whistle. Jacob, slowly and sometimes awkwardly, became present. He sat in plays and volunteer programs. He took Philip to a mechanics show where boys could watch engines hum. He made mistakes, old patterns are adhesive, but he also made amends. He spoke in court, he signed documents, he found a way to be consistent. Miriam, who had endured the friction of doubt and fear, watched him with guarded tenderness. The family's public reconciliation, cameras and reporters were never far, was less important than the small reunions in the kitchen or the quiet afternoons when Jacob taught Helen to mend a bicycle chain. Those moments made a life. There were bitter edges no law could smooth. Amarka, in prison, tried to reconcile her ambition with the consequences. She wrote letters that alternated between petitions for mercy and practical explanations for how she had wanted to be seen.
Her sons, separated from her and each other in the initial fallout, learned different things about love and consequence. Chisholm went to juvenile detention and then to a correction program where he met counselors who taught empathy through exercise and repetition. He would learn to name the harm he had done. Redemption is a long-term project, not a sentence. Public interest slowly waned to a duller hum. Life, the ordinary machine, resumed the work of negotiating new habits. Amanda's companies steadied. There were financial hits and reputations that needed careful tending, but no market stays down forever. Philip's education progressed, bit by bit. Peter's therapy moved from crisis to routine. The children, always the central concern, had to navigate the psychological aftershocks of such early displacement. They both had nights when confusion woke them. They both had adults who erred and then tried to repair. One afternoon, months after the DNA confirmation, Amanda walked through the garden with both boys. The sunlight spilled in a way that made the hedges glow. Bees moved in and out of a lavender patch. Philip, who had learned to read maps, marked a little X on a scrap of paper and declared it the place for a tree. Peter, using touch and memory, placed his hand over Amanda's and asked a simple, earnest question. "Will you stay?" He could not have known the full weight of the request. He only needed the answer. Amanda's throat tightened. She had been the person who believed she could buy certainty. The truth had taught her that love required a different kind of paying. "I will stay," she said. "I will stay and we will figure this out together." The answer was both a promise and a contract that had no legal weight, but carried emotional consequence. Amanda understood the cost, not in naira or in influence, but in time, attention, and vulnerability. She knew the headlines would still ask for more scandal. She knew that Amarka's appeals would wind their way through the system. She knew there would be therapist's bills and school fees, and nights when she would wish for the simplicity of an earlier life. She also knew that the boys had been given something they had not had, a chance to be acknowledged and to heal. There were moments that felt like wounds softening. Philip learned to whistle by watching Amanda's mouth. He learned to make a paper plane and fold it using the geometric rules he relished. Peter learned to listen for the moment a bus would turn the corner and to call out the exact spot where the shadow would fall. They learned to share snacks and to argue about the best music. It was, in the peculiar way of human affairs, both ordinary and miraculous. Justice, too, continued to unfold. Amarka's sentencing was public and stern. Dr. Admi's medical career ended. His name became a cautionary note in professional circles about ethics.
The law had done what it could within its own vocabulary. It could not, however, mend the tender psychic maps of two children whose lives had been rerouted. That work would take therapists, patience, and time. 1 year after the DNA envelopes had been opened, Amanda sat in a small courtroom and testified about what it meant to learn that a child you loved had not been yours by blood. She told the judge, with the forthrightness she brought to business, that money could not replace the intimacy of a daily presence, and that the criminals who profited from children's lives had stolen more than flesh. They had stolen safety. Her words were heavy with personal reckoning and public conscience. The judge considered the statements and ordered restitution where possible, funds to the orphanage, long-term counseling for both children, and community outreach programs to support the vulnerabilities in medical systems that allowed such crimes to flourish. In the quieter hours after court adjourned, Amanda invited Sister Agnes to advise on Philip's schooling. She reached out to Mariam and Jacob to discuss co-parenting boundaries. She petitioned the hospital to review its nursery security protocol in the clear bureaucratic steps institutions take after mistakes become scandals. She paid for upgraded camera systems for the maternity ward in a public-minded move that would, in the future, protect other mothers from the kind of theft she had endured. Even as she pushed for structural changes, she knew that no camera could mend a child's missing years. She could, however, surround the children with resources and a network of care. She set up a scholarship in Philip's name for children from the orphanage who showed academic promise. She instituted a grant for families who could not afford the kind of pediatric care she had once presumed was a given. Actions like these were not penance. They were the complicated moral response she could offer within the privilege she had. The boys grew. Philip's curiosity translated into scholarship. He became a boy who understood both the grammar of poverty and the vocabulary of possibility. Peter, who loved sound and touch, developed into a sensitive, observant child who found his own language and voice. They learned with time and patient help to be brothers in a way that was chosen rather than born into by accident. At night, when the house quieted, Amanda would sit in the nursery and think of the strange geometry of love, that it can include both fiercely held affection and the capacity to be betrayed. She understood that to continue loving Peter, whose life had been intertwined with her, was not a betrayal of Philip, but an act of moral complexity. It honored both children's right to care. She had, in the space of those years, been taught a harsher kind of humility, that wealth could protect and repair only when partnered with attentiveness, and that power without accountability breeds mischief.
The DNA test had done more than assign parenthood. It had cleaved a secret that had lived for years in the margins. It had created, out of raw forensic clarity, the possibility of a life reknit in new ways. Truth, in its bluntness, forced choices. Amanda chose to hold both children and to open her home and resources to the orphanage that had raised Philip. She chose to press the hospital to reform. She chose, with the hard edges of someone who wanted to do right, to rebuild trust with the public and with herself. The legal consequences were not simple, and neither was the human recovery. Amarka served a sentence that spelled consequence but not erasure. Her sons were sentenced to rehabilitation programs and a time for introspection they had been spared in their younger years. Dr. Adme's license was revoked, and his name became a footnote in medical ethics seminars. Jacob, who had once hidden his silence, found himself nationed in headlines not as a villain, but as a complicated man who had been asked to be more than he'd expected. The public, which loves to categorize, slowly accepted the nuance that criminals of different sorts had participated in a painful transaction. A season later, as the city warmed and the mansion's garden filled with the smell of mango and lemon, Amanda set aside a pocket of time and walked through the household. The children played in the light, their laughter different and layered with histories both clean and jagged. She watched them like someone who has seen a sculpture in rough, then polished. Her eyes met Philip's across a lawn, and he waved, a boy who had learned the grammar of belonging anew. She caught Peter's hand in a small, accidental grip as they passed, and he squeezed back, a tiny, reliable pressure that steadied her. There were no miraculous recoveries. The boys would both carry scars and strengths. There would be nights when Amanda woke remembering the 2 minutes in the nursery and wished, with a human wishfulness, to have reversed time. There would be other days when she would stand before a classroom of children at a school she funded and explain in terms they could understand why honesty mattered. What began with a handful of bills handed in a corridor and a decision made in hunger had been solved, scientifically, legally, emotionally, through the blunt clarity of a DNA test and the slow work of human care. The test did what tests do. It laid out the truth in base pairs and sequences. The truth, when exchanged among people, requires translation into mercy and responsibility. Amanda had, by the end of the public proceedings, learned that her capacity to act was both a liability and a gift. She had the means to heal in ways others could not. She also had to use those means with humility. The mansion's halls echoed less with silence and more with a cautious, complex kind of joy. The family, blunted, reconstituted, imperfect, learned to rearrange themselves around new facts.
There is no tidy ending to a story where children were stolen and lives rerouted. There is only work, therapy sessions, court dates that remind people of human flaws, community programs that must be tended, and days broken into small tasks that add up to repair. There are, too, quieter pleasures. Philip's earnest reading of a book aloud, Peter's discovery of a rhythm in folding paper that made him grin, Amanda's occasional, simple, unguarded laugh when she sees them together. When the last public hearings concluded and the press moved on to the next spectacle, Amanda sat with both boys in the nursery and read to them. The story had nothing to do with law. It was about a boat on the sea finding its harbor after storms. Philip listened with the alertness of a child who had learned to measure possibility. Peter rested his head on Amanda's lap and hummed along to the cadence of her voice. Justice had been done in the forms available to a society with courts and procedures. The deeper work of undoing betrayal, of building attachment, of teaching two boys love as both a given and a responsibility, would not be done in courts. It would be done in the daily decisions: who sits at breakfast, who gets a bed in the same room, how they are spoken to about the past, when they are asked what they want. It would be done in the persistence of caretakers, in therapists who returned calls, and in a woman's steady presence when the cameras left. Amanda kept both children. She accepted the paradox as a life practice. She loved Peter for the years she'd raised him, and Philip for the blood that tied him to her and to Jacob. She became a person who held two kinds of truth at once: that a child can be loved and also be the subject of a crime, that restitution does not erase harm but can make a future possible, that money can be used to repair harm but cannot replace the daily labor of human closeness. When the DNA test finally closed the hinge between a billionaire and a poor mechanic, it did more than confirm lineage. It forced a family and a community to reckon with what it costs to rearrange lives for private gain and what it takes to stitch them back together. It revealed thieves and accomplices, and it demanded accountability. It also revealed two boys who deserved dignity and care, no matter the ledger. The city moved on. The camera footage remained in archives. The orphanage continued to house children who needed a roof. The hospital upgraded its protocols. The law did its work, and the family did theirs. In time, the story of the DNA test, the moment when science spoke and the world listened, became a footnote in a larger human narrative, one about how families can be both fragile and durable, how truth can arrive slow and clear, and how decisions echo for years in the lives they touch. Amanda learned to answer questions from journalists with a steady voice. She spoke about accountability, about care, and about the awkward, essential work of loving two children who had been wronged in different ways. If you stayed with this story to the end, if you've been here through the quiet rooms and the CCTV frames and the courtroom, thank you. If this story left you thinking about justice, family, or the strange arithmetic of love, consider subscribing for more stories that dig into the way truth changes lives.